states on the West Coast would benefit immensely because we are a net exporter of our income, of all of our tax dollars, which means that of all the tax that we pay to the feds, we receive back a lower share than we give in terms of services. And our wealth is distributed to lower income states. If that were to shift, so federal rate goes down and commensurately we increase at the state, we would find ourselves with an absolute boon of resources to be able to tackle housing, education, police, fire, all those things, and they would be under our control. So it would be an immense shift and it would be a lot of fun to try to solve problems with those resources.
Welcome to Pacific Time, the podcast where we ask the big what-if questions about the future of the West Coast, its challenges, its opportunities, and the potential for independence. I'm your host, Greg Amrofell. Today we're exploring how the West Coast could rethink governance, taxation, and spending if we were independent. I know. This sounds like accounting stuff, the things we outsource to the people in the green visors. But number one, everything comes down to money. So by giving fresh thought to the way our governments on the West Coast can better manage finances, we open the door to practically exploring how we can double down on our strengths and spend wisely to tackle our challenges. 2, our incredible guest, Julie Dingley, does not wear a green visor. In fact, she eloquently argues for how strategic budgets can be based on her experience as a dedicated civil servant who's managed budgets at the national and local level. Today, Julie is the Chief Operating Officer of U.S. Digital Response, an impressive national and nonpartisan nonprofit that helps governments respond to crises with technology solutions. She's spent years working at the intersection of policy and budgets, including roles at the Office of Management and Budget under both Presidents Obama and Trump, and as Seattle's budget director more recently. Here in Seattle, her work has spanned critical areas from criminal justice policy to homelessness response, and she brings a deep understanding of how government can and should work. Julie offers a compelling vision for how a more focused, outcomes-driven approach to budgeting, one that prioritizes solving problems at scale rather than spreading resources too thin. We explore what a progressive tax structure might look like, how cities and states could wield financial influence, and how strategic planning could make government more effective. Julie's insights challenge us to think bigger about what is possible when we align resources with real human needs. I start by asking Julie about her upbringing in Washington State, what keeps her here in Seattle, and how this relates to the challenges we face on the West Coast, given new pressures on the social contract between us in the West and the federal government in Washington, D.C. Her experience positions her to share an important perspective.
I'm born and raised Washingtonian. I grew up in Bellevue. I now am in Seattle, Washington.
And what keeps you on the West Coast?
To be honest, a lot of family is here, but I just love proximity to nature, the fact that I can go out my door and I can be at the mountains, at an ocean, at a lake, at a river within an hour is pretty magical for me. So I love being able to go outside and take that nature bath, take that big, deep inhale and exhale, and try to forget all the worries of the day-to-day.
That resonates with me as well. Yet we both recognize the West Coast has its challenges. What sort of stands out to you as particularly acute?
You know, we're on the forefront of a lot of climate change that we're seeing, obviously. We have the wildfires in California. We've got floods. We've got landslides. We've got earthquake warnings. We also have a lot of people who want to live on the West Coast, and I don't blame them because it's pretty magical. And so we have housing shortages. We have income inequality. We have a whole bunch of issues that we have to grapple with. You know, some of the country's richest humans live on the West Coast and million X times levels of income. And that's hard for us to fathom. And we have to figure out how to grapple with it.
Drop back in time. Tell me about the work you did at OMB and then in Seattle.
So I started, I actually had a career in radio as my first job, which was hilarious.
Making you an excellent podcast guest. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very overly generous. But, it was the height of the Great Recession, and my organization went from 150 people to 45, and I was looking around thinking, this is not sustainable, and decided I wanted to go to grad school. So I went and got a master's in public policy in Washington, D.C., and while I was there, got a job at the White House Office of Management and Budget. I started as a graduate student assistant, helping them work on their internal technology solutions, which were so archaic by today's standards. So it's kind of hilarious. And then from there, I went into the justice branch of OMB, which allowed me to work on all Department of Justice agencies. And I really focused on the agencies within the Department of Justice that handled state and local grants. And so I was doing work with the Office on Violence Against Women, the Office for Victims of Crime, the Community-Oriented Policing Services Office. So all of those. And so that's where I spent the lion's share of my time there and had, I think, the most formative experiences. And that was a really big shift going from, if you work under the Obama administration in criminal justice policy and budget to then going to a Trump administration. And I ended up having to dismantle under the Trump administration a lot of the things that I had been working to build under the Obama administration. And so professionally for many other personal reasons, but professionally, it was the furthest thing from being rewarding because you're just dismantling brick by brick, literally writing executive orders to undo the executive order you'd written under the previous administration. So it felt like whatever the opposite of treading water is, I guess drowning. It was just terrible. So I ended up moving back home to Seattle, where I landed at the budget office, the city budget office for the city of Seattle, I should clarify. And there I was working on helping homelessness budget and policy and community development and neighborhood engagement. And then when the pandemic hit, I was one of the only people in my group that had experience at the federal level, particularly with grants. And so I ended up leading the funding response for the pandemic for the city of Seattle. Long days in the, emergency operations center, 7 days a week, lots of high pressure. And then with the change of mayoral administration between then Mayor Durkin and then Mayor Bruce Harrell, Mayor Bruce Harrell asked me to be his budget director. And so I was doing that for 2.5 years and then made the transition to U.S. Digital Response.
Wow. Thank you for your service. I should start by saying, what were the differences in philosophy you detected between your time working under the Obama administration and the first Trump administration?
I don't know if we have enough time on the podcast to go into all the differences. I think what really struck me about the Obama administration was every day at work felt very exciting. It felt like we were all working toward a common goal, and that common goal was doing better and helping people. There were deeper political or policy nuances. There were real policy contexts and conversations, but that was the umbrella that we were doing all of our work. And so it felt really rewarding as a public servant to go to work every day and feel like no matter what I'm doing, I'm helping people. Like this feels so good, And what was really great is you would, be asked for deep policy memos, and the president read them. The president would mark up the memos that you wrote, and you would see sometimes, if you were lucky enough, you would see the actual notes in the margins that President Obama had put in there, and you knew that he was really putting in the time and really cared about the outcome. And that was another thing, is they really cared about outcomes. They really cared about, are we making a difference? How do we know we're making a difference? And how can we do better? Enter stage left, the Trump administration, and they were interested in cutting for cutting's sake. I remember sitting in a meeting when the first group came in. They call them the beachhead team. When the first group of new politicals comes in at the beginning of the transition, this is before they have appointed all the political folks to eventually take those roles. And the beachhead team sat us down and they had the entire group, all of OMB, all the resource management offices bring forward updates on what their programs were, what they were funding. And I'll never forget that the Department of Education, their team was before Justice. And so their team went up and they had this astounding presentation. They were knocking it out of the park. It was really clear about the outcomes that they were achieving. And they had the most concrete outcomes of anyone. Because if we measure nothing else, we measure things in education really, really well, for better or for worse. And the beachhead team, it was Russ Vogt at the time, who's now OMB director, but at the time he was just part of the beachhead team. And he said, yeah, how about, that's nice, but we just need to cut it. And they were like, well, if you cut it, the impact is, and then they would, describe the impact. And he goes, yeah, how about to zero? And it wasn't like there was such a callous disregard for the real humans that this would impact. Like, we're talking about food out of children's mouths and books out of their hands. And I mean, like, real concrete things. And they were completely uninterested in even hearing about it.
That feels like a distinction in philosophy, for sure. And what was the difference between working at the city level versus working federally?
Yeah, working at a city level is pretty wild. So you get to, I mean, again, for better or for worse, you get to see the changes that you're working on the ground every day. So one day you're working on parking meter policy rate setting, and you go out to dinner and you pay the new rate in the parking meter, and you're either happy or sad about it, but you're like, hey, I worked on this. Like, because it's 6 o'clock and because there's this many cars on the street, this rate is what it's supposed to be, or, whatever, the new park where you were able to fund the new playground. So it's really concrete and can be much faster moving. The federal government is so vast. It's a big ship to try to turn, to try to make sort of market change quickly is hard. But what's really cool about the feds is how many people you can impact with a single action. We had grants that we would say, we're going to put an incentive on this grant to have a behavior that we want. So one of the things under the Obama administration was, how can we reduce mass incarceration? And so we were thinking about, what incentives can we put in place in our grant programs that all state and local jurisdictions receive that could encourage this? And that kind of scale of impact is just like, it's really hard to even wrap your mind around. I think those are the key differences to me, both very cool in their own right.
I mean, some of this gets back to like Hamilton versus Jefferson type stuff. I mean, do you come away from the experience probably being one of the rare people who's worked for these two presidents and also worked really well at the local level with a viewpoint on federal power versus state and local power?
I struggle with the balance there sometimes. I think sometimes I'm frustrated by it, and sometimes I'm really grateful for it. And I think it's hard for me because I want the feds, I want everyone to take responsibility for what they should take responsibility for and not shirk it off to the states in the name of states' rights. Where the feds need to stand up, they need to stand up, and they need to do it loudly and they need to do it effectively. And where the states need to, they need to as well. So when I'm not frustrated and jaded, I'm really grateful for it, because it means that in times like now, where the federal government is effectively rudderless and it's in a more or less sort of constitutional crisis, the states can really lead, and they have a lot of leeway to do what they have to do. Now, they're not doing it with nearly as much funding as they need, but the way that we're structured, it means that they won't fail, right? Like, they will be able to persevere and figure it out. They'll have to make really tough choices, but at least they're not going to be so severely hamstrung that they can't operate.
Gosh, new threads in every topic. This is great.
I know.
Let me also just step back into the job of managing budgets. I mean, I think in my mind that seems like very wonky work, and you're kind of pushing numbers and managing spreadsheets. But it also strikes me that it's where the rubber meets the road around a lot of policy. And you hear about things at the federal level around like OMB markup is what kind of influences a congressional vote or a president's signing or vetoing. Could you break that down for lay people? What happens with managing budgets in government?
So at the federal government level, technically the budget begins with the House of Representatives. Now, that said, the president, for time immemorial, has proposed a budget from the executive's perspective. But that proposal is only that. It's a proposal. And depending on the political makeup of the House of Representatives and the Senate, is whether you know how much of the president's recommendations are going to be taken or not. When it's functioning as it should, the federal government should adopt an omnibus spending bill, which goes across all the different areas of spending in the budget, from discretionary to mandatory spending and everything in between. What we have seen in the last several, let's call it decades now, because we've had such a divided, and we've always had a divided legislative branch, but because it's to the point where they can't work together, they don't want to, and that's seen as weakness. What we've ended up with is just a sort of halting start-stop of layered temporary spending measures that sort of lurch the government forward 2 to 4 months at a time. Those are called continuing resolutions. And continuing resolutions take the currently enacted budget and say, all right, we're going to just extend this for 3 months. Maybe sometimes they'll add 2% overall to the overall spending of it. Sometimes they'll add in riders like, it's a continuing resolution, except we want to add $50 million to this one pet project. And that's no way to run a country. That's no way to run a country's budget. It's hard enough when you're making a budget and you're trying to meet the needs of all 350 plus million people. But when you're doing it by saying, oh, the last one was good enough, we can just continue that. That doesn't actually adapt and meet the needs that are emerging, the technology that's now available to us. It doesn't evolve in any meaningful way. So it originates in the House. House will propose it. If they pass it, it'll go to the Senate. If the Senate makes significant changes to that bill, then they have to come together and do something called reconciliation. The last time I saw it was with Ryan and Murray back in the early 2000s or 2010s, I think, where they came together and they passed an omnibus, the first omnibus appropriations bill that had happened since the year I was born, 1987. So we're talking, this was a long time coming. And what was so cool about that omnibus spending bill was President Obama knew how important that was. And he came to OMB. He came to the budget office to sign it. So he stood amongst all the program examiners that had built the budget to and then we're going to go implement it and signed it among us, which was a very cool gesture.
Okay. So part of Pacific time is imagination and speculation. You get the chance to wave a magic wand, Julie, and reset the way a country's budget gets created and managed. What do you do?
My dream is that we could build it from the ground up. So we say, what is the future of America that we want to see? How do we want to feel? What is it going to look like? We really vision it. We really say, it looks like no child is hungry. It looks like everyone has a place to sleep at night that's safe and has, basic standards for human survival. It says we want to have clean drinking water, right? You really flesh out what does all of that look like at the end of the day? And then you put out all the other noise and you say, I'm going to table the very niche study into the effects of gambling on mice. I'm going to not worry about that really niche, quote unquote, priority, because I'm focused on what are the big conditions that I need to set for the country in order for us to thrive. And you build it from there. So you build it from the ground up. You say, what's that going to take? That would be enormously disruptive and incredibly powerful. Imagine, instead of spending the $2 trillion that we put out and a peanut butter across all the things we spend money on. And what if we picked as a country even 100 things, 200 things that we were going to absolutely nail? We were going to eliminate homelessness. We were going to eliminate hunger. We are going to make sure everybody goes to college. Pick the problem and solve it and do it. Fund it so that it's done and can be sustained, right? And that's how I would want to do it, is really take a more visionary approach to who do we want to be and what's it going to take for us to get there.
What's getting in the way of that? And do you think that could be resolved?
I think a lot is getting in the way of that. When I take off the dreamer hat and put on the pragmatic one, it is the way we have set up our whole system. It's everything from capitalism to the nonprofit. I'm going to lovingly call it the nonprofit industrial complex, very lovingly so, to the way we run our elections. That we don't have term limits on different roles, and positions of power are not based on within the elected bodies are not based on experience. It's based on tenure, and there's so many reasons why people's incentives are not aligned in order to deliver on something that's visionary like that you'd really have to almost start over. And maybe you just start small, and you test it out. You say, can I, state of Washington, can we do this? State of Oregon, state of California, what would it look like for us to do this and set the model for the rest of the country?
Well, certainly we've heard people say in many ways and at many times that the states and the cities are laboratories of democracy. It sounds like you're a believer in that concept, that meaningful federal change sounds like it's pretty unlikely.
I think it's pretty unlikely. I think that that's absolutely right. The states are going to lead the way, just as they did during COVID, and they're going to continue to lead the way. And then I think the government will eventually catch up, the federal government, but it's not going to be a leader, at least not anywhere in the near future.
Yeah. So now putting yourself in the shoes of your job managing the Seattle budget, I mean, managing a budget on some level is just about revenue versus expenses. If you're looking at that, what percentage of Seattle's budget is coming from the feds?
Directly from the feds, very little. So there's transportation funding that comes in. There's some small funding to support homelessness, but very little. Most of the funding from the feds goes to the states, and then the states distribute it from there. And so we would receive money from the state sometimes, unless we were going for a big grant. Like if we were doing a big infrastructure project, we've had, tens of millions of dollars in grants for a transportation construction project coming from the feds. But because we don't at the city administer Medicare, we don't administer education funds. Those are the big dollars that are coming from the feds that go to the state.
Yeah, and that's something I'd love to get inside of. So stepping back again, maybe more from the perspective of an individual citizen or a company in a West Coast state like Washington. Do you know what is getting spent in federal tax versus what's getting spent in kind of state and local tax?
Yeah, so at the feds, the vast majority of their spending is on entitlements or mandatory spending. So that's things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. It's on defense, interest on the national debt. Those are all mandatory spending, which means you can't cut them. Well, you can, but they have indefinite permanent authority. So they just go. They're like inertia. What we all fight about is discretionary spending, which is just a teeny tiny, if you can't see my hands, it's just a teeny tiny little slice of the pie compared to the behemoth that is all of those mandatory programs. And that's everything: education, agriculture, justice, everything under the sun that you can think of there is some representation of it at the federal level. States are responsible for K through 12 education that's supported from administering that and making sure that everyone has their appropriate funding, and most of that funding comes from the feds. They have to administer Medicaid. They're worried about infrastructure, that's also where higher education, so state colleges, community colleges, a lot of those are funded. Corrections is a big state function as well, although there is a federal prison system as well. But states also, other than the money from the feds, states rely on, depending on the state, revenue from income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes. So they have different modalities of receiving funding rather than just the funding that comes to them from the feds. Then locally, you're worried about schools and police and fire and public transportation and housing and social services, your local swimming lessons, making sure your parks have safe play structures and your beaches have lifeguards. That's the kind of stuff, the real tangible local stuff. And similar to states, the revenue sources that are available to cities really depend on the jurisdiction and the state, but it's property taxes, sales taxes. Some are lucky enough to benefit from income taxes. We don't have that in the state of Washington, so we have high property taxes to compensate. Those are some of the key funding sources.
Let's say that there was a giant shift. Federal tax came way down and states were able to therefore raise their taxes. How would that benefit people just starting here in Washington state?
Wow, that would be a really interesting shift. States on the West Coast, and in Washington state in particular, would benefit immensely because we are a net exporter of our income. So of all of our tax dollars, which means that of all the tax that we pay to the feds, we receive back a lower share than we give in terms of services. And our wealth is distributed to lower income states, mostly in the South and Southeast, but some in the Midwest as well. But we are a net exporter of resources. if that were to shift, so federal rate goes down and commensurately we increase at the state, we would find ourselves with an absolute boon of resources to be able to tackle housing, education, police, fire, all those things, and they would be under our control. So it would be an immense shift, and it would be a lot of fun to try to solve problems with those resources.
What would we lose on the West Coast and maybe nationally with that kind of shift?
I think nationally, the losers are very evident. It's all the folks that are in the quote unquote red states. They ultimately are the big losers there because they would lose. They'd have to close, I don't even know how many schools, if not all. They wouldn't have funding for Medicare, Medicaid. None of that would be adequately funded for them if our resources weren't going to support them. And so it would be devastating for those states.
So I'm going to deploy an analogy here. There's a lot of discussion going on right now about USAID and the billions of dollars that the U.S. government sends abroad to support health and education and lots of things, sort of in the interest of U.S. security and human rights and human development. Is there a parallel with the West Coast exporting tax to other parts of the country where we're supporting development and opportunity in a lot of those places? And if we stopped doing that, the country as a whole would become more unstable?
Absolutely. I think there's absolutely a parallel there. Now, I'm not an international finance expert, so you might have to bring somebody else on to talk to that specifically, Greg. But I think there's an absolute parallel. And when people's basic needs can't get met, then we have a lot bigger problems. And it's hugely destabilizing to take away those resources from countries that don't have it. And we want that benefits us, right? Just in the same way that it benefits us on the West Coast, that we have a more or less, I'm kind of doing this like stir the pot motion. It's like more or less like functioning income distribution across.
Mm. So let's dive in a little bit on the revenue side and the expense side. So on the revenue side, and let's do this from the perspective of Seattle. What are the sources of revenue here?
Yeah, so we have some restricted funding sources that can only go towards certain things, and then we have unrestricted sources. So the biggest source of funding that we have comes from a property tax. The authority comes from the state. And that is capped at, the growth annually in that revenue per year is capped at 1% plus the value of new construction, which in a high inflation environment simply doesn't keep up. And so to supplement the core funding source, that core property tax, the city has to put out things called levies. Those go to the voters for approval, thumbs up, thumbs down, on any niche thing that we need to work on. Usually it's capital in nature. That means that it's an asset we want to build or maintain, like a bridge, a road, a school, and it's not generally for ongoing operations costs. So that would be like salaries for people. There are exceptions to that. We have, 2 education levies in the city. One's for operations, one's for capital. We have in the budget, in the levy for transportation, there was also operating dollars built into that because of insufficient funding at the feds and at the state. So we're forced to supplement with these more niche funding sources, levies that come in. So property, and that goes to property tax. That's a huge percentage. The next biggest comes from sales tax. So that's, the state has a sales tax and we add on to that sales tax. And we're capped at how much we can add on, and we're also limited for what we can use funding for. But we have sales taxes. We also have a couple of sort of sin taxes, if you will. So taxes on gambling, on sweetened beverages. We also have fees. So those can come into play, regulatory fees that we charge in order to make sure that we can have, you'll notice that Ubers, Lyfts, Uber Eats, all of those are more expensive in the city of Seattle. And that's because we've demanded as a city that we've said our value is that those people doing that work should be paid a living wage. They should get sick leave and they should have safe time for breaks and all of that. And that's a value we hold, and that costs more. And so we charge a regulatory fee in order to recover costs to make sure that they have access to the services that they need. So those are the big ones. And then we have, of course, business and occupation tax. So we tax our businesses to say, if you want, for the pleasure of doing business within the city limits, we ask you, you're paying in to that. And then the most famous one recently in Seattle is our payroll expense tax, or head tax, as many call it. And that's a the most progressive tax that we can get until the state changes the laws. But that says for companies that have over a certain number of employees, and if those employees make over $150,000 a year, then they will pay the tax. So you can imagine there are a couple of companies in town that pay most of that into the city, but those are the sort of big buckets locally.
So again, start from scratch. If you could design a tax system for Seattle or for Washington State, how would you do it? And on the way to explaining that, you mentioned the word progressive. I'd love to hear you kind of define what progressive or regressive taxation looks like.
So I would throw out the rule book in Olympia, Washington, and say, you no longer get to decide what we do and don't do with taxes because you haven't done very well so far. So I would say income tax is allowed in the state of Washington and progressive income tax is allowed. That is. Right now, the rules of the road are everyone has to be charged the same exact amount, regardless of income. So if Greg, if you're making $100,000 a year and I'm making $20,000 a year, we're both paying in the same rate. The dollars that I'm paying in are a bigger impact to me on my budget than the dollars you're paying in by virtue of the fact you have more resources. So what I would love to see is a progressive system, which would mean that at certain tiers of income, we would charge a higher percentage of tax because the incremental impact to that individual or that family of those dollars being paid is lower than it would be at a lower income level. And so if you make it more progressive, not only will you bring in more revenue, but it's just more fair. I think there was a study done, I'm going to forget who did it, but I think we rank 49th maybe, if not 50th out of the 50 states in terms of how regressive our tax structure is. If you're trying to own a home in the state of Washington, you have to pay property tax, even if you don't make any money. So it can be prohibitive. It is prohibitive for people to be able to own in our state because of how our tax system is structured.
Earlier in our conversation, you alluded to the amount of wealth and income inequality that is noticeable on the West Coast. How could governments here be doing a better job of tapping into the resources that are concentrated with a very small number of people?
Yeah, we could start by reforming the tax code so that there are fewer or no loopholes available to the uber wealthy to get their tax requirements down to zero. I think Elizabeth Warren speaks very well on this, where she talks about the president has a lower effective tax rate than a janitor or a teacher. And that's public policy. That could be fixed. There are other taxation structures we could consider too. I think it's immoral for us to have companies that have CEOs who are paid such disproportionately high amounts of money compared to their primary workers. I think that we could disincentivize that. We could tax that. That is something we could do. That's within our control. That's public policy. We could do that. There are great thinkers at policy shops around the country that have proposed different things that, if we were able to change our laws in the state of Washington, we would be able to get there. Washington State Institute for Public Policy, as well as I'm going to forget the name of the other one, but they've got great thinking in this space too.
Let's talk about the expense side. I mean, one thing I'll throw at you seems like the pretty widespread view that government nowhere is a super effective user of tax dollars. Respond to that. Do you find that to be true, and do you see ways that it could improve?
Yes, hard yes, both questions. I think what we have in our whole system is a failure of implementation. So we have elected officials who we have decided represent us and our interests, and they have ideas that they say are responsive to their constituents' concerns. They implement them. They don't care, really, truly, at the end of the day, if they have fully funded the issue that they have in front of them. And you can pick any issue, any of them. And chances are, once that bill is passed that appropriates those dollars and makes that law, that politician is not checking up on that program to make sure that it is implemented with fidelity to the original idea. And it's not because the bureaucrat doesn't want to. It's because the bureaucrat doesn't have the resource, doesn't have the answers. So then they are like okay, we just got this mandate from on high, and now we have to figure out how we're going to do this. There's no guidebook. It doesn't exist. And so they're trying to do the best they can while they have oversight coming in. I'm doing air quotes around oversight, coming in and barking at them for not getting it done faster. Well, you can do things fast or you can do them well, but rarely can you do both fast and well when you're talking about something that's brand new and something that is really complex. There are elements of it you can do quickly as you're implementing, but you need time to talk to the people who are most affected to make sure it's going to make sense on how you implement it. And the structures that are in place make that impossible. So yeah, there are programs that are suboptimal. I think that there are lots of things we spend money on that we don't need to because they're vestiges of prior people who were elected. We've got currently in the city of Seattle, in the state of Washington, there are line items in the budget that continue in perpetuity for elected officials that are no longer in office. And are they still valuable? Do they still matter? Do they still make a difference? Are they still meeting a need that's current? We don't ask ourselves those questions. And it would be great if we did. It'd be great if we looked at it and said, what are the problems that need solving and really put the resources there?
The implementation challenge you're describing, would you say it's better or worse at the federal level?
Worse.
And I'd assume it applies at the local level too, but is it better there?
I think it's better at the local level because you're just closer, it's smaller, you have better access. It doesn't eliminate it by any means. But at the feds, the Congress passes something and you get maybe some report language that accompanies the bill that describes in 2 or 3 sentences what they hope the policy is. And then you find out 2 years later during a congressional hearing for oversight that, you got it wrong. But 2-3 years have gone by. And so it's not surprising that we get things wrong. And it's not surprising that more money is sometimes thrown at problems to make them better without looking at what the actual problem is that needs to be solved.
Okay, let's shift gears. Pacific Time is centered on this question. What if the West Coast was independent? So, Julie, what if the West Coast was independent?
Can we make sure everybody else is okay? Okay, so if that's a given, if everybody else is still okay, you could never leave. You'd just be here. We'd have high-speed rail that connected the whole thing. It just would be. I'm sort of at a loss for words because I'm so excited about what that prospect would be. I think you'd have so many humans who want to help other humans, and they wouldn't have to fight people who didn't want to help humans. And that would be so magical. I think you get a lot more done. I think you get a lot more done quickly. I sort of picture there's this great video I saw. It's a parody. It's women. It's if women ruled the world, and it's a meeting of the United Nations, and the women go around the table and they're doing a check-in and they're saying, how are you doing? And Finland pipes up and it's like, everything's great. Our people are doing great. People are happy. The moms work if they want to work. They don't if they don't. And we have supports and blah, blah, blah. And then, someone else pipes up and says, well, we got in a fight with France, but we talked it through and we worked it out and we're all good. And it was just like the power of what it would be like if women were in charge and actually talked about the problems that we had and not sort of knee-jerk react to based on ego. And that's kind of what I picture when I think of if the West Coast were its own entity. It's not necessarily that it's just women, but it's like-minded in that we have a common viewpoint of where we think we should go and how we think we should get there, how we should help each other, what kind of supports should be in place. And we would be working, when you're working toward that common goal, your differences are so much smaller. Then you're having fights like we have sometimes in the city of how to help people in different ways. It's not whether you're going to help them. So I think it'd be pretty magical. I'd be down for it.
Great. And thanks for painting those pictures. How would we pay for it?
Oh, we would have much lower taxes than we have now because we would be keeping our resources locally. I think you would do a progressive income tax across the board. If you didn't have it to pay, you didn't pay it. And if you had it in spades, you paid a lot. And that's the social contract we should have with each other, that no one should be without a home. No one should go hungry. And those are the problems we would solve.
And how would we better manage the expense side of the budget?
I think we'd be able to be more focused on what it is we're trying to do. And when you're more focused, you can have better oversight. You can have better, you put the best minds toward the one problem or 10 or 100 problems that you're trying to solve. And then you say, like, we're going to crack this. We're going to harness all that we have to get. I mean, we have some of the smartest people in the entire country live here, right? Like all the tech minds, all a bunch of startup minds. We've got people who are hungry to do and make and create and imagine. If we could harness all of that to solve public policy problems, like that to me is like, ooh, that sounds great. Sign me up.
What good about either the city budget process you were part of or the federal one would you want to draw in, and what would you want to throw out and change completely in establishing a budget setting process for the West Coast from scratch?
Oh man, that is a really good question, Greg.
Top 3, go.
Top 3. Oh, so much pressure. Okay. I would want to make sure we are able to incorporate the voices of the marginalized better. Right now in the budget, how it's constructed at the federal level, state level, local level, those voices are not adequately heard and represented. They're just not. They don't have an effective, loud, and consistent seat at the table. At best, they're tokenized, and it's at best a line item somewhere that's specifically to support, X population. But there's not a systematic way of representing those voices and making sure that we are all getting what we need, not equally, but equitably to thrive. And so that's one thing I would bring in to the overall process that's lacking. I think one thing I would want to, well, there's not much I'd want to maintain. I got to be honest with you. I'm struggling to come up with something that I would want to keep because I wouldn't want to incrementally budget either. That's where each year you take the budget from the previous year and you just make changes on the margins. You just say, we're just going to increase this one by, $1 million. We're going to decrease this one by $1 million, but it's just subtle tweaks on the edges. I would want to ground up budget. Not, some people call it zero basing or priority based or other styles, but I would really want to go from the ground up and have it be a couple of years, not 1 year. Make it 3 to 5 years. To say, this is our plan, and we are going to revisit the plan to make some changes, but we need consistent funding, consistent direction in order to make progress on any of these priorities. And the whipsawing that happens when new people are elected constantly makes that really hard.
I hear you continue to say that if budgets were centered on a limited set of priorities and had the timeframes for real progress, that the whole system would be working better. Not just the budget system, but the system of government services.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in that. I made a big push. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but I made a big push at the city when we first got our funds from the federal government for COVID response and recovery. And I was not alone in this view, so I feel a little bit safer in saying it. But I thought we should pick 2 problems. Pick 2. And we had $300 million to put out. And that's an enormous amount of money. And we only had 3 years to spend it. So if you had $300 million and 3 years to spend it, and you could house 5,000 people who were unhoused, if you could give every person in Seattle that made less than X amount of money $1,000 a month, so that they could become stably housed, they could put food in their bellies, they could find jobs, they could enter rehab, they could take care of their children or get them daycare, so they could, whatever the thing was that they needed, so that they could actually help themselves in some way. Think of the transformation. I mean, we did some limited investment in those spaces, and where we did it, it worked really well.
I love that thinking. I mean, I really love the idea of focus and priority and strategy. I mean, strategy turns out is the rationing of scarce resources because there's a lot of interests, right? But it seems like if we were designing from scratch on the West Coast and had more local control of our resources, we could design something that looks way more like the way a lot of companies think about budgeting. Hey, Julie, in our waning minutes here, let's quickly play the game of what if. So I've asked the question, what if the West Coast was independent? What's another what if you might ask about the West Coast?
I wonder about what if, I'm a broken record on this, but what if everyone was safely housed on the West Coast?
I'll go with a different one. What if we had a sovereign wealth fund for the West Coast that could invest in the startups and innovations that happen here and produce returns that we could then funnel into programs like getting people housed?
Yes.
Go on. What other what if?
What if we had a West Coast retirement system that supported people and actually paid for end of life care and long-term supports and all those things that we can't do? Like, what if we had that?
Love it. What if with control of more of what we spend in federal tax, we had our own healthcare system that made sure that everybody here had some basic form of care?
Hard yes. What if we didn't treat mothers like pariahs and instead made sure that they had every support they needed to be successful at work and at home? And we had universal childcare that was free. We had education that was free. We had ways to support moms and gave them actual leave that allowed them to recover physically, emotionally, mentally, reestablish their family unit with the new identity that they have with their new brain chemistry. What if we did that?
That's a good one. I like landing on that one. Julie, this has been so fun. Thank you for playing What If. Thanks for thinking about the West Coast. Thanks for all of your service at the federal level and locally. And I hope we'll get to talk again.
Greg, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That was a fascinating conversation with Julie Dingley, filled with insights into government, budgets, and what it would take to create a more effective, human-centered public sector. If there's one lesson to take away, it's that the West Coast has the talent, the resources, and the vision to rethink how government works. Not just in terms of independence, but in terms of effectiveness, equity, and empathy. Julie's perspective reminds us that solving complex problems requires more than just money. It requires strategic focus, long-term vision, and a commitment to real outcomes. Whether it's rethinking taxation, investing in innovation, or ensuring that no one is left behind, her vision challenges us to imagine a better way forward. So maybe the real question isn't just what if the West Coast were independent, but rather, what if we built a system that truly works for everyone? Thanks for being with me in Pacific Time. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves to think big. Until next time, keep asking what if, and let's keep working toward a better future.